What's up everybody? Welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. This time around I'm going to show you how to take small seedlings or cuttings and turn them into a Kabudachi or Clump Style Bonsai like the one you see right here. Okay, so over the last few months, ever since we started Bonsai-U in early 2020, I've been getting a lot of requests from viewers out there who want to see more deciduous or broadleaf content on the Bonsai-U platform. Well, for those of you who have known me for a number of years, or if you've ever visited Eisei-en, you'll know that I'm very passionate about deciduous and broadleaf species, and we actually have a lot of those projects here at the nursery. One of my goals here at Eisei-en is to take native US deciduous material and broadleaf material and turn them into beautiful bonsai similar to what you see in Japan. If you think about how things were developed in Japan over many decades, many centuries, it really just took a handful of people looking for the best native material they could find there and then really focusing on the long-term aspects of development with those species. And that's why you see such beautiful deciduous and broadleaf bonsai in Japan today. Well, the cultural differences between the US and Japan have sort of set us back a little bit in terms of deciduous development because it takes such a long time to develop beautiful broadleaf and deciduous trees. But I'm hoping through this platform to kind of change your outlook on developing these species and sort of shift your mindset to more of sort of a long-term orientation. Now, the tree that's right beside me here, this is a tree that I actually put together myself when I was 16 years old. Now, I'll be 34 coming up here in not too long, so that's well over a decade's worth of work that's gone into this particular tree. Now, I say that not to discourage you, but to inspire you, hopefully, to start to think more long-term when you're developing your deciduous trees. And I want to show you kind of the process of how I built this tree when I was 16 years old. Now, when I did put this tree together way back in the day, I did it at a workshop with a good friend of mine, Bill Valvanis. Many of you guys will probably know who that is. He runs International Bonsai up in Rochester, New York, and he's also the brains behind the US National Show, which happens every other year in the States. So when I went to the workshop, Bill handed me about 9 Japanese maple seedlings and told me to put them together in a clump. So that was sort of the focus of the workshop, was how to build these clumps. But being 16 years old, getting these tiny little seedlings, looking at them, I was thinking, what am I gonna do with this? These just look like little twigs. They're not gonna ever develop into anything interesting. Well, I followed Bill's directions in the workshop, and I'm actually going to show you how this works in this Bonsai-U video here. And over the subsequent, basically 17 years, I slowly developed that tree into what you see here. Now, what I want to do in this video is show you that initial setup where we actually put the seedlings together. Then I'm going to show you a tree that was put together a couple of years ago so you can see where we need to progress sort of in the early stages of the development of these trees. And then I'm going to take you through the repotting process on this particular tree right here, so you can see what the underside of the root ball looks like. So first things first, let's pull out the Japanese maple seedlings and we'll talk about how to actually put them together to create a clump style bonsai like this. All right, so here is our tray of Japanese maple seedlings. Now, when you're putting together a clump style or Kabudachi style bonsai, you want to select for deciduous species that have very small leaves. And within a deciduous species, you want to find a particular cultivar or variety or variation that has small internodes and small leaves, because otherwise you're going to be fighting against those large leaves forever. If it's a tree that can be defoliated, say like a Trident maple, which is another great tree to utilize for this technique, even if you can defoliate that plant, if it's got large leaves on it, it's never going to really develop nice fine ramification, which is of course one of the goals with creating deciduous material. Really our goal is to show these trees in winter when they don't have any leaves, so you can see the fruits of your labor over the course of 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, however long that tree has been in development. So these trees right here are all selected for a very small leaf size. They're all seedlings from the same parent plant as well. Now I want you to think about this here when you're selecting material as well. Ideally, you want to find plants or seedlings from the same parent plant, and you want to select out from that seed base plants that have nearly identical characteristics. So if you're using a seed tray, if you're collecting seeds from the ground, for example, if you're growing, say 100 seedlings in a tray like this, you're going to have some genetic variation. There's going to be some genetic mutation from seedling to seedling. That's just how nature works. So out of those seedlings, you should be able to select out a handful of those seedlings that have very close very, very similar aspects in terms of the looks of the leaves, the size of the leaves, the size of the inner nodes. The reason you want to select for plants that look essentially the same is because when you put these together and they actually fuse at the base, they're going to look like one tree. You don't want to have one of those trunks on the tree have leaves that are 4 centimeters across or a couple inches across, and another tree in that clump have leaves that are only a half an inch or like 1 centimeter across. It will look very, very weird. You're also going to get the leaves opening up at different times. You're going to get different colors on the tree, which, you know, for me, it looks a little bit contrived to do that. I'd much rather have something consistent when I'm building a clump style tree so it looks like one plant that sprouted right from the base, and that's really the goal that we're going for here. So with that in mind, again, you want to select for trees that have very similar leaf characteristics that are all from the same parent plant if you're using seedlings. Now, another option that's actually probably a better option is to take cuttings off of a parent plant that has great characteristics. If you take cuttings off of a Japanese maple or a Trident maple or any other deciduous species, all of those subsequent cuttings are going to have the same genetics. They're going to be genetically identical to one another. So you won't have to worry about variation in leaf size. They'll all be exactly the same. So that would be my main recommendation, is if you can take cuttings, use cuttings to build these clump style trees. Now, again, we're going to be using seedlings here, but I've actually selected out from a tray of seeds, those from the same parent plant with very, very similar characteristics. So I'm not too concerned about them having weird variations once they start developing into a clump style tree. So what we're going to do is pull a handful of these guys out of here. I'm going to show you the process of how to attach them together at the base. Okay, so the first step here is to take a bunch of these little seedlings out of the tray. Now, I don't necessarily want to take all of them out. I think it's going to be too much of a pain to repot them later. So what we're going to do is just select out a few that look like nice ones. And you know, when you're building a clump style tree, eventually you want to have multiple trunk sizes. So diameters in terms of the thickness of the trunk, and also the heights of the trunk. At this stage in the process though, it doesn't really matter. We can select all that are the same size. We can select various sizes. It doesn't matter because they're very young, and we're going to let the tops on these essentially elongate and grow. So I'm not concerned at all with them having variation right now. We can correct for that later, no problem at all. And as a matter of fact, it's better to select little seedlings that actually have relatively thin trunks, so we can put a little bit of wire on them and add some motion so they look quite cool. We'll actually do that in the second or third year after the trunks have fused together. But let's go ahead and pull out a handful of these little maples here. And I'm actually just going to cut these guys out. They're far enough apart that we should be a-okay here, just cutting the roots of these out and separating them here. All right, so that's plenty of roots to work with right here. Now these seedlings here are about, I think they're 2-year-old seedlings, which is just about right. If they're any older than that, if they're any thicker than that, like I said, it's really hard to actually put them together and then put a little bit of movement and motion in them. So, you know, 1 to say maybe 3-year-old seedlings max is what we're looking for when we're creating a little forest like this, or a clump style rather. Speaking of forests, if you're creating a forest, there are a couple of ways to approach it. You can do a similar thing where you select out a species or a cultivar or a variety of a particular deciduous tree that has very similar leaf characteristics to it to keep everything consistent. You can select for multiple different leaf sizes and leaf variations to make it look a bit more natural, for example, or you can mix and match species, which is really cool if it's done well. It's a difficult thing to do, but there are some fantastic examples in Japan. As a matter of fact, my oyakata, Fujikawa-san, his oyakata, Saburo Kato, was very famous for creating forest plantings and for creating them using multiple species. So if you haven't seen Saburo Kato's book, I believe it's called Ezo Spruce Rock Planting and Forest Planting Bonsai, something like that. You can get that book, and there's some really great examples in there of mixed forest planting. So I definitely recommend that you check that out. So in terms of the number of trees that I want to put together here in a clump style, what we're looking for is an odd number. And really we want a clump of somewhere between 3 to 9 trunks. Now I recommend that you start with 9 because inevitably one of those trunks or 2 of those trunks or maybe even several of those trunks over the years will die off. They'll either get suffocated out by the other trunks, by the roots of the other trunks, or they won't get enough water or enough light. So I would recommend that you actually put more trees in at the beginning than you think you might need. So maybe you want to create like a 5 trunk. I would start with 9 and you can always work your way back from there. And again, some of the trunks may not look that interesting in the long run, so you may want to actually cut those out yourself if they don't look nice in the actual design. So again, more is better to begin with, and then you can always reduce it from there. All right, how many do we have now? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's pull out 3 more. There we go. Okay. All right, let's set the tray on the ground, and then I'm going to show you how to actually put these together in a clump. Okay, so now that we've got our 9 little seedlings right here all set up and ready to go, what we're going to do next is work on the roots just a little bit here to make them easier to fit together and to also help promote lateral root growth. So we want these roots to spread out and create a nice radial nabari. So these being seedlings, they're all going to have somewhat of a little taproot. So what I want to do is go through and remove that taproot to start with. We want to make sure we have enough fine fibrous roots further up. If we cut the taproot off, that's not going to kill the seedling. If you don't have enough of these fine fibrous roots right here, I recommend that you replant the tree, possibly even do a little bit of a ground layer to create that radial nabari on here, and then you can go back and cut off that taproot. But most of these right here look like they're going to work just fine. So we're going to cut off all the taproots on these guys to make them easier to fit together, and again, to promote that lateral root growth. Some of these actually don't have much of a taproot on them anymore. So it makes it a little bit easier here. This one's actually quite fine by itself. This guy looks pretty good. We'll get the soil off of here as well so that we can make sure to fit these guys nice and snugly together with one another. Now, in doing this, you want to make sure that every once in a while you're spraying the roots with some water just to keep them from desiccating. So keep a spray bottle handy as you're doing this. The rest of these look pretty good. This looks excellent right here. Get some of this soil off, and the final one here. All right, that looks pretty good. All right, now for the fun part. We're going to actually attach these trunks together at the base. So I'm gonna back the camera up just a little bit here so you can see the full length of these trunks as we put them together, and then I'm gonna show you the base of the trunks up close once we actually attach them. All right, so with our little seedlings here, what we're gonna do is select out the largest of these to begin with. And there are actually quite a few that are somewhat similar in size, but it looks like probably this guy here or this one here are our 2 largest ones in terms of the diameter at the base. That's gonna end up being kind of our middle main trunk, and we're gonna build the rest of the seedlings or the clump style around that one particularly large trunk. So I'm gonna put both of these kind of side by side right next to one another here, and in the future we can let one of these grow to become the main trunk, but I at least wanna get them close together, and those are gonna be kind of our starting point right here. Now, as you're doing this, you wanna make sure that you're getting the bases as close together as possible. If they're touching, that's even better. If not, not that big a deal, because as they thicken over time, they'll actually grow together and fuse together. But if you can get them together right from the get-go, you're that much further along. Now, you don't have to score the base of each of these seedlings to get them to actually stick together and adhere and fuse. So I'm not going to worry about taking, sandpaper or a grafting knife or something and exposing that cambium layer to make them actually adhere. Over time, naturally, they're just going to graft and essentially fuse to one another naturally on their own. All right, so now that we've got those, it doesn't really matter how we build the rest of these around this, but I am going to go sort of in a radial pattern for the most part. And again, I'm going to work these guys in to get them as close as possible down here at the base. And if we need to cut some of the roots that are sticking out, we can. But if we've gotten most of the soil off of here, and if we're just dealing with seedlings, you really shouldn't have to cut many of those roots off. Got a little bit more dirt in here we could potentially pull out though. All right, so the radial surface roots on the larger one here, there's some gaps in between those surface roots, so I'm going to stick some of the smaller seedlings through those gaps, like so. Again, to get them nice and close. All right, and again, we're trying to build this sort of in a radial pattern around those larger trunks there, or larger seedlings. But there really isn't much rhyme or reason to this in general. It's just sticking them together and trying to get them to fuse or adhere at the base from the get-go. Okay, so now that we've got them all really close together here at the base, what we're gonna do is actually tie them together at the base so they don't come apart in the pot or during the repotting process here in a few minutes. or over the course of the next year. Now there are a couple of ways to tie these together. One would be using a zip tie like this. This is a decent option, although it tends to bite into the base of the trees a little bit. Now, a better option in my opinion is to use a piece of rubber and a piece of aluminum or aluminium wire, depending on where you are in the world. Now, the reason I like to use the rubber here and the aluminium wire is so that it doesn't actually bite into the base of the tree. This is much less likely to bite in than that zip tie is. So we're going to be utilizing this today around the base of the plant. Now, I've cut a piece of rubber here that's way longer than the actual size around the base here when we actually tie this together. The reason being is I want this to actually overlap here at the end. I don't want the wire touching those new little seedlings or the trunks of the seedlings at the base at all. I want only contact with the rubber. So this piece of rubber is a little bit longer than the actual circumference here of the base of these seedlings. So first thing here, what we're gonna do is stick the aluminum wire through the rubber. And this is size 2.5 aluminum here, which will hold quite well. That's about the right size for seedlings this size. If you're working with seedlings that are a little bit smaller, you might do a 1.5 mil or a 2 mil. But for these, since they're a little bit larger, we're gonna be using this 2.5 here. Now what I wanna do is make sure that I'm attaching this right at the very, very base, just above the nabari here, so that we can get those trunks to fuse right at the base of the trees here. Again, we're gonna take this, twist it at the end right here, and then I'm going to use the gin pliers here to really crank on this and twist it. And I'm right-handed, so I'm always going clockwise here when I pull and twist. That goes for this type of thing, or if I'm securing a tree in a pot with the wire, or if I'm using a wire for a guy wire, for example, I always pull and twist clockwise. It's just much easier that way. All right, so I'm going to get that nice and tight on there, right at the base. Now you don't want to be tightening it so much that it ends up biting into the trunks or the seedlings and potentially killing them, but you do want it tight enough that it's going to get those guys to stay close together and adhere over the next growing season. All right, so what I'm going to do here is just shorten this up so it looks a little cleaner. All right, and that looks pretty darn good right there. Now the reason I'm leaving this extra long right here is because we did, again, leave that rubber wrapped inside the wire. If I cut it short, it's likely to unravel, unspiral, and come apart. So I'm leaving this extra long. Looks ugly, but it doesn't really matter. This is all gonna get buried underground anyway over the next year. So that brings us to the next step in this process, and that is to plant this thing in a container. So let's do that next. All right, so the next step in the process here is to pot up our new little clump right here. Now, I recommend that you use something that's going to be fast draining and provide a lot of aeration or oxygen penetration to the root system. You're gonna get much faster adherence of the trunks, much faster thickening, and just better development in general. So for the first potting, what I'm gonna be using here is a net pot or a colander. This is often called a pond basket as well. These will be dropped into ponds and plants will be planted in there to grow up to the surface of the water. So in any case, these work really, really well right here. You can get them at various outlets all over the internet. So I'm going to plant this in a very free draining soil mix, and the soil mix that I use is Aoki blend from Japan. It's about a 3/16 inch particle size, and it is 50% Akadama, 25% Kiryu, which is a river sand. And when I say river sand, I don't mean very fine paver sand. Again, that river sand is going to be a 3/16 inch particle size, and then 25% lava rock. This is going to give us a very fast, very free draining mix. It's going to allow the roots to search for that water. We quench that. We do it over and over again. You're going to get a lot of rapid growth out of the plant over the first several years. So I'm going to fill this up and we're going to put the tree on top of it right here. All right, so I filled the basket up about a little more than halfway. So we're going to set this straight down in here. And this is a nice flat bottom to this here. And we're actually going to be burying this in the pot. So I'm not really concerned about tying this in with wires, but I am going to wiggle this down just a little bit to make sure that if there are any little air pockets underneath the root system, that we're eliminating those, because that could potentially kill the plant if we do have air pockets there. Now, after I wiggle this down into here, I'm just going to fan the nabari out on the surface here just a little bit so it's kind of radial. That way, again, we get that nice sort of lateral movement with the roots and a spreading of the base of the tree. And then the final step here is just to fill this up with the same Aoki blend on the top here, and I'm going to work it in a little bit with a chopstick. Okay, so that does it for putting together the initial setup of a clump style or Kabudachi style bonsai. Now the next step here is going to be to take this out and obviously water it until all of the water turns from brown to clear, and then we're going to put it out on the bench, and in about a week to 2 weeks or so we'll start fertilizing this tree. This coming year, I'm just going to let this tree run for the entire year, and then coming up in the second year, we'll actually take this tree out, see if the roots have fused, and then we'll start making selections in terms of the heights of the trunks and potentially putting wire on the trunks as well to get some added extra movement to them and kind of fan them out to make them look just a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Now what I want to do next is take a tree that I actually made last year in the same manner. We're going to take it out of the pot and see if those trunks have fused at the base, and then I'm going to show you sort of that next step in the developmental process. So let's jump into that next. Okay, so this is one of those projects that we put together last year. This is actually a Trident maple, but it was done in a very similar manner to the last tree. The only difference with this one is that we actually did use the zip tie here at the base. And what's really cool about this is that we tightened it so much that it actually started to bite in a little bit. And because this was buried up a little bit higher, it actually started to ground layer itself. In other words, it started to produce rootage above the zip tie, and it's starting to produce it really in a radial pattern, which is great. So this is a benefit of using a zip tie or just a piece of wire with no rubber, is that you can actually sometimes get them to ground layer and create essentially a nice nabari or a new nabari on top of that zip tie or that wire. So in the case of this tree, that's exactly what's happened. The trunks are nearly fused at this point, but I think it needs about another year to really hold on tight. So we're going to leave that zip tie on here. I took it out, I pruned a little bit of the longer roots that were coming off the bottom, and we're going to put this back into another net pot just like the last tree. Now, once I get it in that net pot, in the case of this tree, since it's a little bit taller, a little bit further along, I'm actually going to tie it in with wire into that net pot, and then we're going to style some of the trunks on here. I'm going to put a little bit of motion in those and show you what that looks like. One more note here, if you notice, this tree only has 4 trunks in it right now. When we put it together last year, we used 5 seedlings and one of them died. This is why you want to use multiples more than what you think you're going to want to end up with. So as many of you guys know, the number 4 in Japanese is a bit of a taboo number because it's pronounced in the same way as the character for death. So it's like the number 13 sort of in the West. So, you know, having 4 trunks is not necessarily an ideal situation, but for right now, I'm going to leave them as they are. We're going to replant them, and then maybe at some point down the line, I'll cut one of those trunks out that's not going to work in the final design. But next step, we're going to pot this guy up. Okay, so now that we've got this potted up and secured in the container here, what I want to do is add some wire to all of these trunks to get a little bit of motion and movement out of them to make them look a bit more interesting. So what I'm going to be using here is aluminum wire. This is a 2.5 mil right here. Now, of course, depending on the thickness of the whips that you're working with or the seedlings that you're working with, that will determine the thickness of the gauge of wire that you're using here. But in this case, a 2.5 mil should work just fine. We might have to double it up on the thickest of the seedlings here, but this should work pretty well. Now, what I want to do is cut this wire about 1/3 longer than the length of these right here, because what we're going to do with this is actually stick this into the soil. So I'm going to go right up against the base of the tallest tree. Actually, this is the tallest tree right here. So we're going to go up against the base of that. I'm going to come from the back side here. I'm going to push this all the way down to the very bottom of the container here, and that's going to give us a nice secure holding for this wire, so when we actually move the trunk, it doesn't slip and slide all over the place. Now, as I'm putting this wire on, I'm going at about a 45-degree angle, which is pretty typical for working with broadleaf material. They tend to be a little bit more brittle than working with conifers, or at least most conifers anyway. So a 45-degree angle is going to give you a little bit of extra holding power. If this were a conifer, I'd probably knock that up to like a 60-degree angle, because it's not really necessary to have such a tight pitch on a piece of coniferous material, again, depending on the species. All right, so we're going to take this all the way up to the very end here. And as you can see, we got a little bit left over, which is totally fine. I'd rather have too much than too little. All right, now we're going to go through and do that with the remaining trunks on here, and then I'm going to put them into a nicer position. Okay, so I ended up doubling up on 3 out of the 4 trunks with that 2.5 mil wire. Now, typically what I recommend is that you do that rather than putting on a piece that's super thick that might actually bend it, just as a single piece. Because if you put a really thick piece of wire on here, you run the risk of damaging the bark or cracking those seedlings in half. So I recommend that you use 1 size down or half a size down and then double up just for safety's sake. Now the next step here is to set these trunks. So what I want to try to do is create some sort of sinuous look. Something that looks like it's supposed to fit together, basically. In other words, I don't want some of the trunks going one way, some of the trunks going the other way, and then the movement not to match. I want everything to look consistent throughout. So what I want to do is start with our main trunk here. This is our tallest and thickest one. So it's actually slightly on the back side as it's planted now. Again, this thing may shift completely around. We might end up using the other side in the long run as the front, but for right now, we'll look at this as the potential front for the tree. So I want to start with that main trunk. I want to take it to the rear first and then forward and then some movement side to side. This is going to give us depth, and it's also going to give us side to side movement where you look at it from the front. It looks quite interesting. So for the depth portion, we're going to take it towards the rear just a little bit here, then back around. Then we're going to bring it forward, a little bit of side to side motion all the way to the very top here. That looks pretty good to start with. All right, now the next step is to set the secondary trunk here, the one that's the second largest. So we're going to do that. Now what I want to do is try to mimic at least the first portion of the movement of that first trunk here. So I'm going to take it to the interior here to get a little bit of motion. We're going to bring it back this direction. And again, I'm going to take it out to the side, and this one's going to come a little bit further forward since it's on the front side of our main trunk here. That way, again, we're building depth front to back, so it doesn't look so one-dimensional or two-dimensional. We want that 3D kind of look to this tree when we view it from all angles. All right, so that feels pretty good right there. Now the next step is going to be the next smallest trunk, which is this guy here. Now I don't want all of these going the same direction. I do want them to fan out and away from each other to be a true clump style. We're not trying to build kind of a windswept type look. We want it to look like a big broadleaf tree that you might see growing in a field somewhere. So I do want it moving this direction, but I also want the movement of this trunk to mimic, again, the main trunk line here. So we're going to take it out, back up a little bit, back out again, and instead of whipping the apex back in the same direction to the left there, I'm going to have it actually finish coming out to the right here, and that's going to give us that outward movement that we're looking for here. That feels pretty good right there. All right, and then the final trunk, of course, is our little guy over here. So I'm just going to mimic the internal curve, or the first curve here, of that secondary trunk. And again, since the tree is on average moving to the left, I want the apex of this one also to move out to the left as well. All right, something along those lines. That's a pretty good start for setting up a tree like this. It gets you that general movement in it. Now the next step here is to make sure that we don't let this wire bite into these trunks. If you've ever worked with deciduous trees, you know that if the wire bites in at all, you'll forever have scars. They'll never really heal over, and they'll always look pretty ugly. So we really have to keep an eye on this to make sure that it doesn't bite in. What that means is as the leaves flush out here, once they harden off, by here in Tennessee anyway, about mid-May, that's about the right time to cut the wire off. Sometimes they'll thicken up faster and you have to cut it off earlier, but ideally if you can leave that wire on through the first flush of growth, hardening off, that usually is enough to set the trunks or at least get them to stay somewhat in position. Of course, you'll have to rewire them, say, next year, for example, at the same time, just add a little bit more motion to them. But hopefully we'll be able to get it to stay by essentially mid-May. Now, at that particular point in time, once the leaves start hardening off, then we'll start fertilizing this tree at that point, blowing the thing up and trying to thicken certain trunks, especially that main trunk here. I want that thicker than the other trunks in the future. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Bonsai-U. In the next episode, we're going to jump into actually looking at that fully developed Kabudachi style Japanese maple that I showed at the beginning of this episode. And I'm going to take you through the steps of repotting that, looking at the underside of the roots, and really showing you how to develop a nice radial spreading nabari on a Kabudachi style tree. Thank you guys so much for checking out this episode. If you like what we do here, make sure to like and subscribe down below. And if you really want to support us, you can click on the link in the description down below. It'll bounce you over to our website where you can make a donation to support Bonsai-U going forward. I want to thank you guys so much for checking out this episode, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care.